Before he passed, Johnny Carson revealed 9 guests who were secretly gay. The line between truth and illusion in Hollywood has always been razor thin. For over 3 decades, one man sat at the center of it all, the charming face behind The Tonight Show, who made millions laugh every night, while quietly carrying secrets that could have shattered the world's brightest stars. He wasn't just a host, he was the silent witness to the most carefully guarded lives in show business. Behind every handshake, every joke, every elegant smile across that desk, Johnny Carson saw what the cameras never could: fear, loneliness, and the constant fight to stay hidden in a world that demanded perfection. And before his final days, Carson confessed what he'd known all along, that some of Hollywood's most beloved icons lived double lives, forced to play roles far more painful than anything they performed on screen. Tonight, we open that chapter and uncover the 9 names Johnny could never forget, the legends whose truths were buried beneath the golden glow of fame. He was the man every woman dreamed of, and every man wanted to be. Rock Hudson, tall, charming, effortlessly magnetic, Hollywood's ultimate romantic hero. To the world, he was the perfect picture of masculine grace, the leading man who brought warmth and humor to every silver screen love story. But Johnny Carson knew something no camera could ever capture, that the dream itself was a lie. Night after night, as Rock sat on the Tonight Show couch, smiling through stories about his marriage and movie romances, Johnny would glance at him with quiet understanding. Because behind that smile was a man living in constant fear. Fear that one wrong word, one unplanned question, could expose everything. Hudson's image wasn't just managed, it was manufactured. His agent, Henry Wilson, had built him like a brand, even arranging a marriage to Wilson's own secretary, Phyllis Gates, to silence the growing whispers about his sexuality. It was a performance that went far beyond the screen, a role that demanded perfection, secrecy, and sacrifice. For 3 years, the illusion held. Rock and Phyllis smiled for the cameras, walked red carpets hand in hand, and sold the story of a love that never truly existed. To the studios, it was business. To Rock, it was survival. Carson once described these Hollywood arrangements as institutionalized lies. He didn't judge, but he felt the weight of them. To him, interviewing men like Rock Hudson was like standing in the middle of a storm, knowing the truth, yet being unable to say a word. And when Hudson's final chapter came in 1985, when the world learned that the Hollywood heartthrob had died of AIDS-related complications, Johnny was shaken. He saw not just the tragedy of a life cut short, but the cost of a lifetime lived in disguise. Rock Hudson had given the world romance. But the one thing he could never live was his own. If Rock Hudson was Hollywood's dream, then Cary Grant was its fantasy. Elegant, sophisticated, impossibly charming, Grant defined an era where men wore tuxedos as naturally as smiles. He was the silver screen's ultimate gentleman, adored by women, envied by men, and idolized by generations who believed in the myth of perfect grace. But Johnny Carson knew better. Because behind every perfect image, there's a story quietly trembling beneath the surface. Grant's life had always been an illusion carefully woven by the studio system. He was known for his wit, his warmth, and his ability to disarm anyone who crossed his path. But what few knew was that his charm wasn't just a performance for audiences, it was armor. Rumors had long followed him, whispers about his close friendship with fellow actor Randolph Scott. The two had lived together in the 1930s, sharing a Malibu beach house that gossip columns nicknamed Bachelor Hall. Inside those walls, they lived free, cooking, laughing, hosting quiet dinners far from the prying eyes of the Hollywood machine. But outside, every glance was scrutinized. Every photograph analyzed. The studios feared the truth. They needed their leading men to be untouchable symbols of masculine perfection, not real, not vulnerable, and certainly not different. Carson, who admired Grant deeply, once said in private conversations that Cary carried a loneliness hidden behind laughter. He could make the world laugh, but rarely himself. Even in his later years, after 4 marriages, the speculation never faded. It only grew quieter, like a secret everyone agreed not to mention. When Johnny looked at Grant, he didn't see a mystery. He saw a man who had spent a lifetime trying to fit into a mold he never chose. Because in Hollywood's golden age, even legends had to act, not just on screen, but in life itself. He was lightning in human form, wild, unpredictable, and gone far too soon. James Dean wasn't just an actor, he was a revolution wrapped in leather and loneliness. His eyes carried something that couldn't be scripted, a defiance against the world, and a sadness that felt centuries old. When Rebel Without a Cause hit theaters, America saw a new kind of man, fragile yet fearless, bold yet broken. But what the world didn't see was that Dean's rebellion wasn't only against society, it was against the role he was forced to play. Johnny Carson once called him, the kid who never got to grow up. And he was right, because behind the fame, behind the smirk that made girls swoon, James Dean was fighting battles few ever spoke about. In private, he was gentle, quiet, and far more complex than the Hollywood image painted him to be. He shared deep, emotional connections with both men and women, but in the 1950s, such truths were unthinkable. So Dean buried his heart under layers of rebellion, speed, and danger. He found a strange comfort in the company of other artists who lived on the edge. People like Marlon Brando and the writer William Bast, who would later admit their closeness went beyond friendship. But in that era, love between two men wasn't seen as love at all. It was a secret that could end a career overnight. Carson understood that. When guests spoke of Dean's legend on The Tonight Show, Johnny would often pause, not to reminisce about the fame, but to remember the boy behind the myth. The boy who wanted to be free, but only found freedom in death. At just 24, James Dean's Porsche crashed into history. And while the headlines mourned the rebel who died young, Johnny knew the truth, that the real tragedy wasn't his death, but the life he never got to live. Because James Dean didn't just rebel against the world. He rebelled against the silence that world forced upon him. He was raw power in human form. A man who could silence a room with just a glance, who turned acting from performance into truth. Marlon Brando wasn't just Hollywood's greatest rebel, he was its most complicated soul. When Johnny Carson spoke of him, he called Brando the one man who didn't act, he became. And that was true, both on and off the screen. From a streetcar named Desire to The Godfather, Brando lived through characters that mirrored his own chaos. Passionate, unpredictable, and always on the edge of breaking. But few ever knew the depth of his inner storm. Behind the camera, Brando's life was a contradiction. He loved fiercely but trusted rarely. He sought truth in his art, but hid his truth in life. For decades, the industry whispered about his relationships, his defiance, his refusal to conform to any label or rule. And while many were afraid to speak, Brando didn't care much for silence. In one interview he once said bluntly, "Like a large number of men, I've had homosexual experiences, and I'm not ashamed." It was a statement that shocked Hollywood, especially in an era still clinging to illusion. Carson, who admired Brando's fearlessness, saw the pain behind those words. He understood that for Brando, truth was both weapon and wound, something he used to protect himself, yet something that cost him dearly. Behind the fame, Brando's personal life was marked by tragedy, the loss of his son, the isolation of stardom, and the torment of being a man who carried too many secrets in a world not ready for honesty. Carson once said off-camera, Brando was the only guest who didn't need the stage. He was the stage. And yet, when the lights went out, he was just another soul haunted by what he couldn't say out loud. He terrified millions as Norman Bates in Psycho, a performance so chilling it redefined horror. But what people didn't know was that the scariest part of Anthony Perkins' life wasn't the movie. It was the mask he had to wear when the cameras stopped rolling. Johnny Carson had interviewed Perkins early in his career, shy, polite, almost painfully soft-spoken. Behind that gentleness, Carson sensed something else, a man caught between the truth he lived and the image Hollywood demanded. Perkins knew what it meant to hide. He spent most of his youth terrified that someone would discover who he really was. Studio contracts in the 1950s were clear. No scandal, no suspicion, no deviation from the image of the perfect leading man. So Perkins dated women publicly, but privately, he found companionship in quiet corners. Men who understood the same fear, the same longing to be seen for who they truly were. He even underwent therapy to try to cure himself, a tragic reflection of the times he lived in. And though he eventually married actress Barry Berenson and had 2 sons, Those who knew him closely said he never escaped that feeling of being divided in two. When Carson heard of Perkins' death from AIDS-related complications in 1992, he reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before going live. Because to Johnny, it wasn't just another headline. It was another reminder of how many beautiful souls had lived and died, hiding from the world they helped entertain. Montgomery Clift was the kind of actor who didn't need words. His eyes told entire stories. He was vulnerable, magnetic, and devastatingly human. But behind those gentle eyes lay a lifetime of heartbreak. Carson often described Clift as the actor who made pain look poetic. And that was no exaggeration. Before his tragic car accident in 1956, Clift was one of Hollywood's brightest stars, often cast as the brooding romantic, the sensitive outsider. He worked alongside legends like Elizabeth Taylor, who became one of his closest friends and protectors. But like so many in that era, Clift lived in a prison built of expectation. Whispers about his private life grew louder, especially after his looks were scarred by the accident. In a town obsessed with beauty, his injuries became both literal and symbolic, the breaking of an illusion. After the crash, Clift turned inward. He became reclusive, self-critical, drowning his pain in alcohol and silence. Johnny Carson never had him on The Tonight Show, but he often spoke of him with reverence, as if talking about a ghost who had once walked among stars. When Clift died alone in his New York apartment in 1966, the coroner called it the slowest suicide in Hollywood. Carson, upon hearing that line, reportedly whispered, "No, it was the loneliest." Tab Hunter was the studio's dream come true. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the smile of a storybook hero. But behind that charm was another story entirely, one that Hollywood tried its best to erase. In the 1950s, Hunter was one of Warner Brothers' biggest stars. He was paired in romantic comedies and musicals opposite leading ladies who adored him, on screen, at least. Off-screen, he lived a life of constant fear. Carson, who had Tab on his show years later, once said, "He smiled like a man who knew the cost of every smile." And that was true. Because in 1955, Hunter's secret nearly destroyed him. A tabloid discovered that he had been arrested years earlier at a private gay party, a scandal that could have ended his career instantly. Warner Brothers moved quickly, burying the story, arranging fake dates with actresses, and rebuilding his image. For decades, Hunter played along, until, finally, in 2005, he told his story in his memoir Tab Hunter Confidential. He spoke openly, with grace and humor, about the double life he had been forced to live. When Carson's old colleagues read the book, they said Johnny would have admired him, not for the confession, but for the courage to tell it. Because in a world of masks, Hunter finally chose to show his real face. He made millions laugh, yet few ever saw the sadness behind his eyes. Paul Lynde was a comic genius, quick, sharp, flamboyant, a man who could turn any line into gold. But humor was his armor. Carson knew him well. Paul was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show, and his energy always lit up the room. But after the cameras stopped, Johnny often saw the exhaustion, the deep sighs, the quiet moments when Paul's eyes looked somewhere far away. Lynde never publicly discussed his sexuality, though it was widely known in the entertainment world. He joked about it in coded ways, playing characters that hinted at the truth everyone already knew. But he also suffered from the isolation that came with living behind laughter. By the late 1970s, Paul's drinking worsened. He felt trapped, too famous to start over, too lonely to stop pretending. When he died suddenly in 1982, the industry mourned the comedian who made the world laugh, but Johnny Carson mourned the man who just wanted to be accepted. For a generation, Richard Chamberlain was television royalty. Dr. Kildare, the Thorn Birds, Shogun. He had the looks of a hero and the charm of a saint. But beneath the spotlight, he carried a secret that followed him for decades. Carson hosted him several times, and even back then, Johnny could sense something unspoken. Chamberlain was polite, controlled, always careful with his words, as if every sentence had been rehearsed to perfection. It wasn't until the early 2000s that Chamberlain finally spoke his truth. He revealed that he had hidden his sexuality for nearly 40 years out of fear that Hollywood would destroy him. His confession wasn't bitter. It was peaceful. He said, "I spent so many years protecting an image, I almost forgot who I was." Johnny Carson, had he been alive to hear it, would have likely nodded in quiet understanding. Because he'd spent a lifetime interviewing people who wore masks, and he knew better than anyone that the hardest role to play is yourself. In the final years of his life, Johnny Carson became more reclusive. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared in public. But to those who knew him best, he often reflected on the guests who'd sat across from him. The stars, the icons, the dreamers. And sometimes, in moments of quiet honesty, he'd speak about the pain he'd witnessed, how so many of them smiled while silently breaking inside. He never judged them. He admired them. Because to Carson, these weren't just celebrities, they were people who had carried unbearable truths in a world that wasn't ready for them. One night, long after he'd retired, he told a close friend, "I hosted laughter for 30 years, but the hardest stories were always the ones that never made it to air." Those stories, of Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, James Dean, Marlon Brando, Anthony Perkins, Montgomery Clift, Tab Hunter, Paul Lynde, and Richard Chamberlain, were more than Hollywood gossip. They were reminders that behind the glamour, behind the fame, there were human hearts, fragile, frightened, and yearning to be seen. Johnny Carson never exposed their secrets. He protected them. Because he knew that sometimes, silence isn't denial, it's respect. And as the curtain fell on his life, Carson left behind not just laughter, but a legacy of empathy, a quiet acknowledgement that truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds its light. Candle, this was the world Johnny Carson knew, where fame and fear walked hand in hand, and where even the brightest stars lived in shadows. But in the end, those shadows told the real story of Hollywood.